You probably already know this story. August 1971, Stanford University. A psychology professor named Philip Zimbardo randomly assigned 24 male students to play either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison built in the basement of the psychology building. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was stopped after 6 days. The guards had become brutal. The prisoners had broken down. Ordinary college students, given roles and a uniform, had transformed into something unrecognizable. The lesson that got printed in every psychology textbook for the next 50 years: put ordinary people in a position of power over other people, and the situation alone will corrupt them. Evil is not in individuals. It is in systems. It is in roles. That lesson shaped prison reform debates, corporate ethics training, military conduct guidelines, and how an entire generation of psychologists understood human nature. There is just one problem. The experiment was compromised from the beginning in ways that took decades to fully surface. And the lesson everyone learned may not be what actually happened at all. Let's start with what the textbooks say, because the gap between that version and what the records show is the real story here. The standard account goes like this. Zimbardo selected psychologically healthy volunteers. He randomly assigned roles. He stepped back and observed. Within days, the guards had independently developed their own brutal tactics. The prisoners had lost their sense of self. The situation had done everything. Zimbardo himself became so immersed in his role as prison superintendent that he lost his scientific perspective entirely. He was pulled out of it only when his girlfriend, Christine Maslach, visited the experiment and was the only person among dozens of observers to say, simply, that what was happening was wrong. The experiment was stopped. Zimbardo went on to write a landmark book called The Lucifer Effect, arguing that the capacity for evil lives in circumstance, not character. That is the version that exists in popular culture. Now here is what the recordings show. In 2018, journalist Ben Blum published a detailed investigation titled The Lifespan of a Lie, drawing on previously unreleased audio recordings from the experiment. The recordings revealed that the guards were not simply given roles and left to their own devices. They were coached. A research assistant named David Jaffe, who played the role of warden inside the simulation, gave explicit instructions to the guards on how to behave. The recording captures Jaffe telling the guards they needed to be tough, that they needed to show they were in control, that they should create an atmosphere where the prisoners felt powerless. Zimbardo himself, in his role as prison superintendent, reinforced this framing in conversations with the guards before the experiment began. The guards were told what the experiment needed them to produce. The most aggressive guard in the experiment, a man known by his prisoner nickname as John Wayne, was later identified as Dave Eshelman, a student who had modeled his behavior on the prison warden from the film Cool Hand Luke. Eshelman gave an interview in which he stated clearly that he had been performing a character. He knew it was theater. He was playing a role he had consciously chosen, not being transformed by an invisible situational force. He later said he had pushed the behavior as far as he could to see what the experimenters would do. They did nothing to stop him, so he kept going. The experiment rewarded cruelty. It did not produce cruelty from nothing. There is another piece that the textbook version quietly removes. Not all the guards were cruel. A third of the guards, by Zimbardo's own records, were actively kind to the prisoners. They brought them extra food. They did small favors. They tried to make the experience easier. The standard account of the Stanford Prison Experiment erases this third entirely. If the situation alone was responsible for the brutal behavior, the kind guards need to be explained. They were in the same situation. They wore the same uniforms. They were given the same instructions. The fact that they chose differently is significant, but it doesn't fit the story the experiment wanted to tell, so it was left out. The prisoners present their own complications. One prisoner, identified in records as Subject 416, was not broken by the experience in the way the textbook describes. He launched a hunger strike. He refused to eat. He was placed in a small, dark isolation chamber the guards called the Hole. The other prisoners were told they could get 416 released from the Hole if they gave up their blankets. They refused to give up their blankets. Zimbardo later pointed to this as evidence of how thoroughly the situation had dehumanized the prisoners. They would not sacrifice comfort to help their fellow prisoner. But 416 later gave his own account. He said the entire thing felt theatrical to him. He said he could tell the experimenters wanted distress. He was performing distress to see what would happen. When he asked to actually leave the experiment, he was told he couldn't leave. He was told he had to stay. A research participant being told they cannot leave a study they no longer wish to participate in is not a scientific finding. It is an ethical violation. The deeper problem is structural. Zimbardo was simultaneously the designer of the experiment, the principal investigator, the prison superintendent inside the simulation, and the person responsible for deciding when the experiment should stop. Those roles are fundamentally incompatible. A scientist cannot objectively observe a situation they are actively participating in and have a financial and reputational stake in producing a specific outcome from. Zimbardo had been funded in part through a grant from the U.S. Office of Naval Research, which wanted to understand the causes of conflict in naval prisons. The experiment had institutional pressure to produce findings about prison dynamics. The experiment was also never subjected to standard peer review before its findings were circulated. It was not published as a controlled study with replicable methodology. It spread through Zimbardo's own presentations, his media appearances, and eventually his book. In 2002, researchers Alex Haslam and Steve Reicher at the BBC conducted a partial replication of the Stanford experiment with significantly more rigorous controls. Their results were the opposite. Guards in the BBC prison study did not spontaneously become authoritarian. Prisoners organized collectively. The guards were uncertain and anxious. When given power, most people did not default to cruelty. Without active encouragement toward brutality, the situation alone produced neither dominance nor submission. The BBC study is rarely mentioned in the same breath as the Stanford experiment, despite being far better controlled. So what does the Stanford Prison Experiment actually tell us? It tells us something real, but smaller and stranger than the textbook lesson. It tells us that people are exquisitely sensitive to institutional cues about what behavior is expected of them. That when an authority figure signals that aggression is acceptable and will not be punished, some people will produce that aggression. That bystanders will often rationalize or ignore harm when it happens within a sanctioned institutional context. That is still a genuinely important finding. It is relevant to prisons, to corporations, to militaries, to any hierarchical structure where authority is concentrated and accountability is thin. But it is not the same as the lesson the textbooks teach. The textbook lesson says the situation does everything. Character does not matter. Any of us, given the uniform, would become the guard. The records say some guards were brutal because they were told to be and rewarded for being so. Some guards were kind despite the pressure. And the person most responsible for what happened in that basement was not an invisible situational force. It was a man who knew exactly what he was doing, needed a particular result, and built a stage on which to produce it. The most disturbing thing about the Stanford Prison Experiment is not what it revealed about human nature. It is what it revealed about how easily a story, told with confidence by the right person in the right institution, can become the thing everyone knows, even when the recordings say otherwise.